No lawyer? Then you've already lost. My brother Wade said it loud, the way you say a thing you want the whole room to carry home. A couple of people in the gallery laughed. My father nodded along beside him, slow and proud, like Wade had just read out something off a wise man's tombstone. I set my folder down on the dentist's table. Just set it down. The clasp clicked shut against the wood, and for some reason, that was the sound that made the laughing stop. Not a shout, not a gavel, just a small brass click in a county courtroom that hadn't been painted since the Reagan years. Their attorney looked at the folder. Then he looked at me. Then he stopped looking quite so comfortable. He didn't know yet that for 31 years I read ledgers exactly like the one Wade had filed against our mother's estate. He didn't know I'd spent a career finding the $4,000 somebody swore wasn't missing. He was about to. I'd like to tell you, I felt something good in that moment. I didn't. I mostly felt tired. The kind of tired that sleep doesn't touch, the kind you earn watching a family decide who you are without once asking you. I was 64 years old, in a coat I bought the year Tom died. And not one person in that room believed I could hold my own. To understand the look on the lawyer's face, you have to go back about 3 months, to a tomato soup afternoon in Beaufort, when the certified envelope came, and my hands, for once, didn't shake. It was raining the slow way it rains on the Carolina coast in late winter. Not a storm. Just gray water coming down like the sky had nowhere better to be. I was standing at the stove, stirring a can of tomato soup I had no real appetite for, watching the marsh grass bend flat in the wind out past my kitchen window. My right knee was aching. It does that before weather. Has for years now, ever since a loading dock fall in '94 that I never bothered to get looked at the way I should have. The mail carrier knocked instead of leaving it in the box. That's how I knew before I opened the door. Certified mail gets a knock. I signed for it standing in my socks. County seal in the corner. My name typed out in full, Eleanor Margaret Ridgeway, like a stranger had filled in a form about me. Inside was a civil complaint. My brother Wade was suing me. The claim was that I had used undue influence over our mother, Ruth, in the last year of her life, that I had isolated her, manipulated a woman with failing memory into rewriting her will, and steered the family property on Front Street into my own hands. I read it standing up. Then I read it sitting down. Then I turned off the stove because the soup had started to scorch, and the smell of it filled the whole kitchen. And I just sat there at the table with the burnt tomato smell and the rain, holding 4 pages that called me a thief. My hands didn't shake. That part came later, that night, alone, the way it always does. You learn that in my old line of work. The body waits until the room is empty before it lets you feel anything. You sign for the bad news, you stay flat, you read it twice, and you fall apart on your own time. Here is the thing they got wrong about me, all of them, for 40 years. They thought I just worked for the government. Paperwork. A desk somewhere in a beige building. My father used to tell his friends at the marina that his daughter did some kind of office job for the Navy. That was the whole of it to him. What I actually did was follow money. I spent 31 years as an auditor for the Defense Contract Audit Agency, forensic accounting, mostly, though nobody calls it that at a family barbecue. When a defense contractor billed the government for 400 bolts and delivered 390, somebody had to find the missing 10 and the dollars attached to them. That somebody for a long stretch of my life was me. I sat in cold rooms in Norfolk and San Diego, and once for 11 weeks in a trailer outside a shipyard in Pascagoula, reading invoices until my eyes burned, matching numbers nobody expected anyone to match. People think fraud looks dramatic. It doesn't. It's almost never a briefcase of cash. It's a decimal moved one place to the left. It's a date changed by a single day so a payment lands in a different quarter. It's a line item described just vaguely enough that no one asks. Corruption is patient and it is boring. And it survives precisely because checking the work is boring too, and most people won't. I will. That's the whole skill. I'm the woman who checks. So when my mother started calling me late at night in her last year, I noticed things other people would have let slide. The calls started about 18 months before she died. Not emotional calls, careful ones. She'd wait until after 9 when she figured Wade had gone home, and she'd ask me strange small questions in a low voice. "Nell," she said one night, "can the county really raise the property tax that much in a single year?" I sat up in bed. "How much did it go up, Mama?" "Wade says it nearly doubled." It hadn't. I knew that without checking. But I checked anyway the next morning because checking is what I do. Carteret County property tax records are public. The assessment on the Front Street house had gone up a normal 2% that year. Nobody had doubled anything. Somebody had told my mother a number to explain where money was going. The number was a lie. I didn't say that to her. You don't, not on the phone, not to an 83-year-old woman who sounds frightened in her own kitchen. I just said, "Let me look into it, Mama. Don't you worry about the taxes?" She was quiet a moment. Then she said the thing I still hear. Wade gets upset when I ask questions about the money. So I stopped asking. My mother raised 3 of us and buried 1. She ran the books for my father's boat repair business for 30 years without a single error the IRS ever found. She was not a woman who got confused about a checkbook. And she was telling me she'd learned to stop asking questions in her own house. Because it made my brother angry. That was the night I started paying attention. Quietly. The way I know how. Let me tell you about Wade, because you can't understand any of this without understanding him. And you can't understand him without understanding our father. Wade is 57 now. He was the youngest, the only boy, born 9 years after me when our parents had given up expecting another. My father, Carl Ridgeway, was a Korean war man. Army, 2 years, didn't talk about it, who came home, took over his own father's boatyard, and built a hard, narrow, decent life with his hands. He believed in a particular order to things. Sons stayed. Daughters stayed closer. A family was a thing you could see all in one room at Sunday dinner, and anything that pulled a person out of that room was suspect. I pulled myself out of that room in 1981. I was 19. I'd tested into a federal accounting program, and it meant leaving Beaufort, and to my father it might as well have meant leaving the planet. He didn't forbid it. He just went quiet in a way that lasted, in some form, the rest of his life. The day I left, he was out on the dock with a customer's outboard, and he didn't come in to say goodbye. My mother stood at the end of the driveway and waved until I couldn't see her in the mirror anymore. Wade stayed. Wade always stayed. And in my father's arithmetic, staying counted for more than anything I ever did anywhere else. It didn't matter that Wade's marina supply business failed in '99. Or that the charter operation failed in '04. Or the dredging contract thing in '09 that I still don't fully understand. And that I'm fairly sure left a man in Morehead City unpaid for a season's work. Every collapse was somebody else's fault. A bad partner, a bad bank, a bad winter, and every time my parents covered the hole. My mother quietly, my father proudly. Because Wade was the son who stayed, and a son who stays gets second chances a daughter who leaves never has to ask for. There's a particular memory I keep coming back to, from a Thanksgiving maybe 4 years before all this. I'd driven down from Virginia. Tom was still alive then, and the whole family was at my parents' table, and somebody asked, the way somebody always did, what I actually did all day. Before I could answer, Wade laughed and said, "She files things for the Navy." "Right, Nell. Real exciting. Stamps and staplers." Everybody chuckled, my father chuckled. And I sat there with 30 years of work in my hands and I let it go. Because what was I going to do? Explain forensic accounting over the turkey? I just said, something like that, and passed the green beans. Tom squeezed my knee under the table. He knew. That was enough then. But it builds that kind of thing. A lifetime of something like that. A lifetime of letting people make you smaller because correcting them costs more than it's worth. You tell yourself you don't care, and mostly you don't, and then one day you're 64 and your brother is calling you a thief in a courtroom, and you realize the small erasures were practice. They were teaching the whole family, year by year, that you didn't count. So that when the day came to call you a criminal, no one in that room would think to doubt it. I'm not bitter about it. I want to be clear about that. Because bitterness is a kind of dishonesty, and I've spent my life being honest about numbers, so I try to be honest about myself. I made my peace with my father's coldness a long time ago. I had a good life. I married a good man. Tom Ashby was a civil engineer for the state. Bridges, mostly. The unglamorous ones on county roads that nobody thinks about until they're gone. We met in Norfolk in 1989 over, of all things, a disagreement about a parking space. We were married 26 years. He understood my work better than anyone, partly because his own was a quieter cousin of it. Both of us spent our careers making sure something held that other people assumed would hold on its own. He used to say, "Nobody thanks the bridge that doesn't fall." Then he'd grin like he'd invented the line. He hadn't. He'd just said it enough that it became his. Tom died 6 years ago. Pancreatic. 11 weeks from the diagnosis to the funeral, which is a cruelty I won't describe here, except to say that I learned what the inside of the Duke Cancer Center looks like at 3 in the morning. After he was gone, I retired, sold our place in Virginia, and came home to Beaufort. Not to fight anybody, just because I was tired of hotel rooms and empty mornings, and because at 60-some years old, the marsh and the salt air and the sound of the shrimp boats felt like the only place left that knew me young. I thought, foolishly, that coming home might mean coming home to family. Let me tell you what my days looked like that first year back, because the ordinariness of it matters. I'm not a dramatic person. My career was 31 years of not being dramatic. I'd get up at 5:30 out of a habit, no pension could break, make coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and walk the half-mile down to the town docks before the tourists were awake. There's a man named Hollis who sells shrimp off his boat 3 mornings a week, and I'd buy a pound, whether I needed it or not, because his wife had passed the same year as Tom, and we'd reached an understanding that neither of us had to say anything. We'd just stand there on the dock in the dark, 2 widowed people, watching the water lighten. Some friendships don't need words. The good ones rarely do. I kept my house plain. Tom's reading chair by the window, his fishing cap still on the hook by the door where I couldn't make myself move it. A wall of books on bridges and accounting that nobody but the 2 of us ever found interesting. I'd relearned how to wear regular clothes after a career in which I mostly wore the same 3 neutral suits, and I still didn't quite trust the brighter things in my closet. They felt like they belonged to a woman braver about being seen than I was. I wore a little makeup to church and felt like a fraud in it every time. The uniform of my life had been invisibility, and I'd worn it so long it had become the only thing that fit. I tell you this so you understand what they saw when they looked at me. A small, quiet, gray-haired widow in clothes that didn't quite suit her, who bought too much shrimp and kept her dead husband's hat by the door. Harmless. Forgettable. The kind of woman a confident man assumes he can talk over. My whole family made that assumption. It was the most expensive assumption any of them ever made, and not one of them saw the bill coming, because the thing about being underestimated is that the people doing it never know they're doing it. They think they're just seeing clearly. The first year was all right. Then my mother started getting sick, and Wade moved closer to her, and I started getting cut out of things in a way so gradual I almost talked myself out of noticing it. I'd call the house and Wade would answer my mother's phone. I'd drive over and Wade would already be there, and somehow every conversation would route through him. Mama's tired today, Nell. Mama doesn't really remember that, Nell. Mama gets confused if too many people are around, Nell. He'd say it gently, with a hand on her shoulder, and she'd look at me over his hand with an expression I couldn't read at the time and have thought about every day since. It's a specific thing, what he was doing. It has a name. I didn't have the name for it then the way I do now. He was making himself the only door to her. Everything you wanted to know about Ruth, everything you wanted to give her or ask her, had to pass through Wade. That's not love. That's a kind of construction. You build yourself into the one wall everyone has to go through, and then you control what gets carried in each direction. What I didn't know yet, what I wouldn't know until I was standing in a records office in Beaufort with a knot in my stomach, was exactly what he was carrying out. The last good conversation I had with my mother was 8 months before she died. On her back porch, late September, the marsh gone gold the way it does. Wade had gone to the hardware store. We had maybe 40 minutes. She held my hand the whole time, which wasn't like her. My mother loved her children the way her generation did, in casseroles and clean laundry, and being on time, not in held hands. So the held hand told me something was wrong before she said a word. You always could find things, she said finally. Even as a girl, you found my wedding ring in the garden that summer. Everybody else gave up. I remember. If anything ever didn't add up, she said, and then she stopped and looked out at the water and didn't finish the sentence. Mama, if anything ever didn't add up, what? She patted my hand. I'm just an old woman talking, she said. And then Wade's truck was in the drive and her face changed. Closed like a shop pulling its shutters at dusk, and we talked about the weather until he came up the steps. She mailed me something 2 weeks before she died. I'll get to that. She passed on a Tuesday in October, in her own bed, which she'd wanted. The funeral was at the Methodist Church on Ann Street, where she'd been a member for 51 years. I gave no eulogy. Wade gave one. It was about himself, mostly. About the burden of caregiving, the sacrifices he'd made, the toll it had taken on him. He stood at the front of a church full of people who'd known our mother longer than they'd known their own spouses, and he talked about how hard her dying had been on him. My father sat in the front pew and nodded. I sat 3 rows back, next to Tom's old fishing buddy Earl, the only person who'd thought to save me a seat, and I held my own hands in my lap, because there was no one to hold them, and I thought, she tried to tell me something on that porch, and I let the moment pass. But something happened at the reception afterward that I didn't understand until much later. An old woman I half recognized came up to me by the coffee urn, Mrs. Pruitt, it turned out, from the church, and took both my hands in hers and said, "Your mother told me what you did about the taxes, dear. She said you were the only one who'd ever truly take care of her." I thought she was confused. I thought she had me mixed up with somebody. I hadn't paid the taxes yet. That came later. But my mother had known they were unpaid, had known the house was in danger, and had told her friend at church that her daughter Nell would be the one to set it right. She'd been telling people, quietly, who I was. While her own son was at the front of the church telling them who he was, she'd been working the room in whispers, planting the truth in the only soil she trusted. It took me months to understand that the woman everyone called confused had been running her own quiet campaign of honesty right up to the end. 3 of my mother's friends found me at that reception. Not one member of my own family did. The Sunday school women, the choir women, the woman who'd brought her casseroles for 50 years. They came to me one after another and told me small true things about my mother and looked at me with a warmth my own father couldn't manage from 10 feet away. That's the cruelty the genre of family does so well. Strangers will honor you in the same hour your own blood pretends you aren't there. And the stranger's kindness doesn't soften the family's coldness. It sharpens it. It shows you exactly what you were owed and didn't get. 12 days after we buried her, the certified envelope came. I want to be honest about what I felt reading that lawsuit, because I think people imagine it was rage. And it wasn't. Not at first. The first thing I felt was a terrible sinking recognition. Because a fraud accusation is a structure, and I have spent my whole life inside structures like it. And I could see immediately that this one was built backwards. Wade wasn't suing me because I'd manipulated our mother's money. Wade was suing me because I was the one person in the family who could read what he'd done to it. The complaint was a preemptive strike. Accuse the auditor first, loudly, publicly, and by the time anyone looks at the actual books, the auditor is the suspect and not the witness. It's an old move, crude, but it works on people who don't read carefully. And nobody in my family reads carefully. Except me. I sat with it for a long time. Then I did the only thing I know how to do when something doesn't add up. There was one more thing before I started, though. And I should tell it, because it's the moment I knew there'd be no settling this quietly. About a week after the lawsuit came, I drove over to my father's house, the Front Street house, still standing because I'd already, without telling anyone, kept it standing. To try to talk to him. Wade's truck was in the drive. Of course it was. He met me at the door and didn't let me past it. Stood there in the doorway of the house I'd just saved from auction and said, "You've got some nerve coming here." Behind him I could see my father in his chair, the television on, not turning around. "Wade, I just want to talk to Dad." Dad doesn't want to talk to a woman who robbed his wife blind. He said it loud enough to carry into the street where a neighbor was getting her mail. You waltz back into town after 30 years of looking down on all of us. And the second Mama's in the ground, you go after the house. We all see it, Nell. The whole town sees it. You can play the grieving daughter all you want. Everybody knows what you are. I stood on the porch of my mother's house and let him say it. I didn't tell him I'd paid the taxes. I didn't tell him about the records I was already pulling. I didn't tell him anything. Silence has a way of making people fill it, and Wade filled it with 3 more minutes of exactly who he thought I was, while my father sat 10 feet away and didn't turn his chair around. I drove home. I didn't cry. I just understood, finally and completely, that the only language left between us was the language of documents, and that I happened to be fluent in it, and he happened to think I was a clerk who filed things for the Navy. So I started pulling records. It took me 11 weeks. I'm going to tell you what I found, because the finding is the heart of this, and because somewhere out there is a woman my age watching this who is starting to get the same late-night phone calls I got, and she should know it can be done. You can do this. The records are there. Most of them are public, and the ones that aren't, you have more right to than the person hiding them wants you to believe. I started with the county. Carteret County keeps property records, tax records, and recorded liens, and any citizen can walk into that office on Courthouse Square and ask. I did. The clerk was a kind woman named Donna, who'd known my mother from church. And when I told her whose daughter I was, she got me coffee in a paper cup and left me alone with the files. Here is what the Front Street property records showed. 18 months before my mother died, when she was still, by every account including the doctor's, mentally competent, a deed of trust had been recorded against the house. Wade had refinanced it. He'd taken out a home equity loan in the amount of $218,000 against a house that had been free and clear for 30 years. My mother's signature was on it. So was a notary stamp. Now sit with the problem in that, because it's the whole case, really. If my mother was competent enough to sign a $218,000 loan agreement, then she was competent. You can't have it both ways. You cannot claim your sister manipulated a woman too confused to know her own mind, while standing on a $250,000 loan that same woman supposedly signed of her own free will 6 months earlier. One of those things is a lie. I knew which one, but it got worse, and this is the part that made me put my coffee down. The property taxes on the house had gone unpaid for 19 months. The county had filed a notice. There was, sitting in that public file, the early paperwork of a tax lien, the legal process by which a county can eventually take and sell a house out from under the people living in it for unpaid taxes. My mother had spent 50 years in that house, and at the end of her life, it was 19 months into the machinery that ends with a courthouse steps auction, and nobody had told her. Or my father. Or me. I paid it. That afternoon, in Donna's office, I wrote a personal check for $16,412 and stopped the lien. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't do it to look good. I did it because my father was 86 and still living in that house, and I was not going to let him be put out on Front Street for a debt my brother had buried. $16,412. I still have the canceled check. It turned out to matter, so now I had two things. I had a refinance that proved my mother was competent, and I had a near foreclosure that proved someone had stopped paying the bills on a house while taking $250,000 out of it. The two facts pointed the same direction, and the directions was not me. But two facts about a house aren't a story about a man. I needed to know where the money went. That took the rest of the 11 weeks, and it took skills I had hoped I was done using. I won't bore you with all of it. The short version: I had power of attorney too, an old one my mother had signed for both her children years back, before any of this, and it gave me the legal standing to request her account records from the bank. The bank fought me a little. Banks do. I sat across a desk from a young man in Morehead City and explained calmly, in the specific language of someone who has subpoenaed records from defense contractors, exactly which federal and state provisions entitled me to my own mother's statements. He went and got his manager. I got the records. I'll tell you the part of the method that matters, because it's the part anyone can use. You don't follow money by looking at the big number. The big number is where everyone looks, which is exactly why the people moving it have already dressed it up. You follow money by looking at the boring edges, the timing, the description fields, the round numbers that should be uneven, and the uneven numbers that should be round. An honest transaction tends to look a little messy, because real life is messy. A dishonest one is often too clean. 11 transfers of almost exactly $20,000 each, all on the first business day of the month, all to the same entity, with the memo line left blank. That's not how a man pays for a marina. That's how a man pays himself and writes nothing down because writing it down would mean naming it. So I made a timeline. I'm a great believer in timelines. I put every transfer on it, and then I put my mother's medical appointments on it, and then I put the dates of the property tax notices on it, and then I put the dates of Wade's late-night visits, which I reconstructed from my mother's own calendar, the paper one she kept by the kitchen phone, because she wrote everything down. God bless her, even Wade came. asked about money again in her small, careful hand. And when you lay all of it on one page, time tells the story that the individual documents won't. The transfers spike in the same months the tax notices arrive. The visits cluster around the days she'd been to the doctor, when she was tired and frightened and least able to push back. You can see the shape of it. You can see a man timing his asks to a woman's weakest days. That's the whole craft. Not genius, patience. The willingness to make the boring timeline that nobody else will sit still long enough to make. The money from the refinance. The $218,000 had moved out of my mother's account in 11 transfers over 14 months into an LLC called Coastal Marine Holdings. There was no Coastal Marine Holdings. I mean, there was on paper registered with the state, but it had no property, no boats, no employees, no marina. It was a shell. It was the place Wade put money he didn't want explained. The marina expansion he'd been telling our parents about for 2 years, the big project that was finally going to turn his luck around, existed nowhere on God's earth except in 11 wire transfers from a dying woman's account. I had it all by February. Bank records, county records, the deed of trust, the tax lien, the canceled check, the LLC filings showing the shell with nothing in it. I built it the way I'd built 100 audit files in my career. Clean, indexed, every claim tied to a document, nothing asserted that couldn't be proved. I made 3 copies. I'm a careful woman. And then, the week before the first hearing, I opened the envelope my mother had mailed me 2 weeks before she died. I'd been carrying it in my bag for 3 months without opening it. I knew her handwriting on the front. I knew that if I opened it I'd hear her voice, and I wasn't sure I could hold the file together and hear her voice at the same time. So I'd waited. A coward's mercy, maybe. But I waited until I was strong enough. Inside was a single sheet of her flowered stationery and a small object wrapped in tissue. The note said in her careful hand, "Nell, you always could find things. If it ever comes to it, this is the truth in his own words. I love you. I'm sorry I waited." Mama. The object was a little digital voice recorder. The cheap kind they sell at the drugstore. My mother, 83 years old, frightened in her own house, had bought a voice recorder and learned how to use it. I'm going to stop there for a moment, because I need you to understand what that took. A woman of her generation, her health failing, who'd been taught all her life that you don't make trouble, that you keep the family's business inside the family. That woman went to a store, bought a device she didn't understand, figured out how to work it, and recorded the truth so her daughter would have it after she was gone. Because she knew she wasn't going to be brave enough to say it out loud while she was alive. So she made sure she'd say it after. I listened to it alone, at my kitchen table, at 1 a.m, with the marsh dark outside. It was a conversation between my mother and Wade. North Carolina is a one-party consent state. One person in a conversation can lawfully record it, and she was that person, in her own home, so the recording was hers to make and hers to give. I knew that the way I know most things. By checking. On the recording, my mother asks Wade where the money from the refinance has gone. Her voice is thin. She asks twice, gently, the way she asked me about the taxes. And Wade, I've heard this maybe 4 times total and I won't listen to it again. Wade tells her to stop asking. He tells her she's getting confused. He tells her that if she keeps stirring things up, he'll have to think about what's best, and that maybe she shouldn't be living alone, and that these decisions might not be hers to make much longer. He says it softly. That's the worst part. He never raises his voice. He just stands in his mother's kitchen and tells her, gently, that her questions about her own money could cost her her home and her independence. And she says, and this is the last thing on the recording, and it's why I could barely breathe. She says, "All right, Wade, I won't ask anymore." Then the recording ends. That's the woman they called confused. That's the woman I supposedly manipulated. She wasn't confused. She was outnumbered and frightened, and she did the one brave thing left to her, which was to make a record and mail it to the only one of her children who'd believe a document over a feeling. I sat in my kitchen until the sky went gray over the water. I didn't cry. Exactly. It was past crying. I just sat with it. Then I put the recorder in the file, with everything else, indexed and labeled, and I got ready to go to court without a lawyer. Not because couldn't afford one, but because I'd realized something. The case wasn't complicated. It was simple. It only looked complicated to people who hadn't read the documents. And there was no lawyer alive who could read those documents to a judge better than the woman who'd spent 31 years learning to read exactly that kind of document to exactly that kind of room. Which brings us back to the courtroom, to Wade saying, "No lawyer? Then you've already lost." To my father nodding. To the click of my folder closing, and the laughter stopping, and the lawyer who looked at me and stopped looking comfortable. The judge was a woman named Marion Cole, late 60s, silver hair pinned up, the kind of judge who'd clearly seen every family in the county try to set itself on fire over an inheritance and had stopped being surprised by any of it. She looked at me over her glasses. "Ms. Ridgeway, you're representing yourself in this matter. You understand this is a serious civil proceeding." "I understand, Your Honor." "And you're certain?" "I am." Wade's lawyer Sutton, a Moorhead City man with a good suit and a bad case, though he didn't know it was bad yet, stood up smooth and started in on his opening. The narrative was exactly what I'd expected. The lonely, ambitious sister who'd abandoned the family for a government career, swooping back in at the end to charm a confused old woman and capture the family home. He said estrangement 4 times. He said vulnerable 6. He gestured at me, sitting alone at my table like the empty chairs beside me were evidence of something. I let him finish. Silence has a way of making people fill it, and I've never minded letting them. When it was my turn, I didn't make a speech. I'd watched enough of these to know that the side with the weaker facts makes the speeches. I stood up and I said, "Your Honor, may I approach with documents the court can verify independently?" And then I started laying it out, not loud, just in order. The deed of trust first. "Your Honor, opposing counsel's claim is that my mother was too cognitively impaired to make her own decisions. This is a recorded loan agreement for $218,000, executed and notarized 18 months before her death, bearing her signature. I'd ask the court to consider, if she was competent to sign this, and the opposing party relies on this loan, so they cannot say she wasn't, then she was competent. The claim of incapacity and the existence of this loan cannot both be true." I watched Sutton's pen stop moving against his legal pad. First crack, the tax records next. The 19 months of unpaid taxes, the lien notice. Then the canceled check, $16,412, drawn on my account paying it off. The county can confirm every figure, Your Honor. The party who supposedly captured this house for herself is the party who paid to keep it from being auctioned out from under her own father. My father shifted on the bench. I didn't look at him. I couldn't, yet then the bank records. The 11 transfers, Coastal Marine Holdings. This is the entity the funds moved into, Your Honor. I've included the state filings. The court will find it owns no marina, no vessel, no real property of any kind. It employs no one. It is a registered shell. Sutton was on his feet now. Your Honor, none of this was disclosed. We haven't had the opportunity to. It was all available in public records, Counselor, I said. Not to him, to the judge. Every county document is public. The bank records I obtained under a valid power of attorney as the decedent's daughter. I can provide the statutory basis if the court wishes. Judge Cole looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at Sutton. "Mr. Sutton, do you dispute the authenticity of the county records?" Sutton couldn't. "You can't dispute a recorded deed." He said something about needing time. The judge said something back about how he'd had 3 months. And Wade was staring at me now, with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since we were children. Since the day our father caught him in a lie about the fishing radio he'd broken and tried to pin on me. It's the face of a person realizing the floor isn't where he left it. "There's one more item, Your Honor," I said. I told the court about the recording. What it was, how it was made, why it was lawfully made. One-party consent, her own home, her own conversation. I told them my mother had recorded it herself and mailed it to me before she died. Sutton objected before I finished the sentence. "Hearsays," he said. He was almost relieved to have something to object to. And Judge Cole held up a hand and looked at me, and I could see her deciding whether to let me dig my own grave. Ms. Ridgeway, you understand the rules of evidence well enough to know counsel may have a point." "I do, Your Honor. It's offered not for the truth of any statement, but as evidence of the declarant's state of mind and of the conduct of the party now claiming she was incompetent. And there's an exception the court is aware of for a statement of the declarant's then existing mental condition. But I'll leave admissibility to your judgment. I'd only lock the court to consider listening to it in chambers before ruling on whether the jury, or this court, ever hears it. I'd done my reading. You always do your reading. Judge Cole was quiet. Then she said she'd review it in chambers. She took the recorder. She took the whole file. And she called a recess. And the gavel came down. And the room exhaled. And for the first time all morning, nobody was laughing. There were people in that gallery, it turned out, who'd come for reasons I hadn't understood when I walked in. During the recess, 3 of them found me. The first was Donna, the county clerk who'd gotten me coffee in a paper cup. She'd taken a personal day to be there. She didn't say much. She just stood next to me by the window in the hallway and said, "Everything you put in front of that judge, I pulled the originals myself. It's all true. I wanted to be here, in case anybody said it wasn't." She'd known my mother from church. She'd watched me build the file across her counter for 11 weeks, document by document, and she'd decided on her own that the truth deserved a body in the room. The second was a man I didn't recognize, heavyset, work boots, a Carhartt jacket he hadn't taken off indoors. He introduced himself as Ray Tillett. He said, "Your brother stiffed me $11,000 on the dredging job in '09. I worked a whole season I never got paid for. I always knew the money went somewhere. I just never had the papers to prove it." He nodded at the courtroom door. "You've got the papers." He'd read about the hearing in the county legal notices and driven 40 minutes to watch a stranger finally put numbers to a thing that had cost him a winter. Most people who get cheated never get to see the ledger opened. He'd come to watch it open. The third was Mrs. Pruitt, the churchwoman from the reception. She was using a walker now. She'd had her nephew drive her. She found my hand and held it the way my mother used to, the held hand that meant something her generation couldn't say out loud, and she said, "Ruth would be proud of you, Eleanor. She told me you'd be the one." She said it more than once. Most people send a card. She'd had herself driven across the county on a bad hip to stand in a hallway and tell me my mother had believed in me out loud to her friends, when I wasn't there to hear it. I want you to notice who showed up. Not my family. A clerk. A cheated contractor. An old woman with a walker. The people who'd watched the truth get buried over the years and never had to standing to dig it up. They came to watch someone finally do it. That's who honors you, in the end. Not the people who owe you the most. The people who recognized you when it cost them nothing, and remembered you when it cost them something. In the hallway, my father came to me. He moved slower than I remembered. The courtroom seemed to have aged him a decade in an hour. "Nell," he said, "that loan. The taxes. Did Wade?" He couldn't finish it. His hands were shaking, the arthritis and something else. "You didn't know," I said. It wasn't a question. I'd watched his face during the bank records, and I'd seen it land on him in real time. And you cannot fake that. He hadn't known. For 3 months, I'd believed my father chose Wade over me knowing everything. And standing in that hallway, I understood the worst truth. He'd chosen Wade over me knowing nothing. Because believing his daughter was a thief was easier than believing his son was one. "I didn't know," he said. His voice broke on the second word. I should have felt something like victory. "I keep telling you I didn't, and I need you to believe me, because it's the truest thing in this whole account." I felt tired, and I felt sad for an old man, and underneath all of it I felt the thing I'd carried since I was 19, and he didn't come in off the dock to say goodbye. I just wanted my father to know who I actually was. Not to win. To be known. Court came back in an hour later. Judge Cole had listened to the recording. She did not play it in open court. She said on the record that she had reviewed it, that she found it relevant to the question of capacity and conduct, and that she was admitting it under the state of mind exception, with findings to follow. Then she looked at Wade for a long, level moment, and she said something I'll remember the rest of my life. "Mr. Ridgeway, I have heard a great deal in this courtroom over the years about confused old women. I have rarely heard from one as clear as your mother was on that recording. The mask didn't slip off Wade's face so much as fall off it, all at once. What happened after that? Happened. Fast, the way these things do once the structure goes." Sutton asked for a recess to confer with his client and came back 20 minutes later to withdraw the complaint against me. There was nothing left to stand on, and a smart lawyer cuts a dead case loose before it takes him down with it. But withdrawing his case didn't make my evidence disappear from the record. Judge Cole referred the financial findings, the shell company, the transferred funds, the near foreclosure, for further review. That's not a thing a person walks away from clean. Wade's marina money had a name now, and the name was on a court record. And there were people in Morehead City who'd been waiting a long time to attach his name to a number. I'm told it's still working its way through. I don't follow it closely. That surprises people. They expect me to want to watch him burn. I did go to one thing later. A few months after the hearing, there was a meeting at the bank in Morehead City. Wade had finally been forced to account for Coastal Marine Holdings to the people who'd put money into it, and one of those people, it turned out, was my father. Wade had taken $31,000 from our father 2 years earlier for the marina expansion. Money my father had pulled out of his own retirement. The small, careful retirement of a man who'd repaired boats with his hands for 50 years. Wade had never told me. Wade had never told anyone. He'd taken his elderly father's savings for a marina that existed in 11 wire transfers and nowhere else, and then he'd sued me to keep anyone from looking at the books. I found out because my father told me at my kitchen table with his face in his hands. That was the thing that finally broke him. Not the courtroom, not the recording, but the slow understanding that the son who stayed had been quietly emptying him out the whole time, while the daughter who left had been the one paying the taxes to keep his roof over his head. The son he was proud of had taken his retirement. The daughter he was ashamed of had saved his house. I'd had it exactly backwards for 40 years, and he'd built his whole life on having it that way, and now he had to sit in his daughter's kitchen and feel the whole structure come down. Here's what I learned in 31 years of finding the missing money. The documents do the work. You don't have to be cruel. You don't have to raise your voice. You just have to be the person who checks, and then you have to be willing to set the file down on the table and let it speak. The truth doesn't need you to scream for it. It needs you to keep it indexed and refuse to look away. The hardest part wasn't the courtroom. It was 3 weeks later. My father came to my house. He stood on my porch in his old brown jacket holding a grocery bag. For no reason, the way men of his generation need something in their hands when they don't have the words. He'd brought soup. I almost laughed. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd listened to my mother's recording at 1 a.m, and for a long time neither of us said anything, which between us was nothing new. Finally he looked out at the marsh and said, "Your mother loved this view. I know. I was hard on you." He said it to the window, not to me. "When you left, I told myself if you went off chasing some career you'd forget us." I think he stopped. I think I made it true by acting like it already was. 40 years. I'd waited 40 years for some version of that sentence, and now that it was here it didn't fill the hole the way I'd imagined. It just sat in the room with us, true and late, both at once. "I didn't forget," I said. "You stopped answering the phone. I know it." He turned the soup can around in his hands. There was a long quiet, the marsh wind pushing at the window. "Your mother used to leave the room when I'd say something short about you," he said. "Just get up and go do dishes that were already done." She never said a word to me about it. 40 years, and she never once told me I was wrong about you. He shook his head slowly. I think now that was her way of telling me. The getting up. The dishes. I just wasn't smart enough to read it. I thought about my mother at the sink washing clean dishes so she wouldn't have to sit and listen to my father shrink me. And I understood something about their marriage I'd never let myself see, that she'd been quietly on my side the whole time, in the only language a woman of her generation and her temperament had, and that her recording was just the last and loudest thing in a lifetime of small refusals to agree with him about me. "What you did," he said. "The auditing, the court. You really did that? All those years? All those years, you never told me, you never asked." There it was. 6 words. I'd promised myself I wouldn't, and then I did, because some things have waited too long to stay unsaid. He flinched, but I wasn't trying to wound him. I was just finally telling the truth in his own kitchen, the way my mother had told it in hers. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, almost too low to hear, "I told the men at the marina you did office work. For years. When they'd ask. I made you small so I wouldn't have to explain a daughter I didn't understand. It was easier to have an off-the-job daughter than a daughter who did something I couldn't picture." He looked at his hands. "That's a thing a man should be ashamed of. I'm ashamed of it." He nodded slowly, like a man taking a blow he'd been bracing for. Then he did something I'd never seen my father do. Not at my mother's funeral, not at his own father's. He put his face in his shaking hands and he cried. "I was proud of you the whole time," he said into his hands. "I didn't know how to be proud of you out loud. It looked too much like saying I was wrong. Some damage doesn't come out, no matter how late the apology. I want to be honest about that too. My father saying that did not give me back the goodbye on the driveway, or the eulogy I never got to give, or the 40 years. It didn't make us close. We are not now a close family. There's too much road behind us for that, but he came in off the dock. After 40 years in his way, he finally came in off the dock to say goodbye to who he'd thought I was, and to meet who I actually am. And that turned out to be worth more than winning. Wade and I don't speak. I don't expect we will. There was no scene where he broke down and apologized, no movie ending. He chose, even after the recording, even after all of it, to be angry at me rather than at himself. Some people do. The bitterness has somewhere to live in him that the truth can't reach. I've stopped trying to reach it. That's its own kind of peace. Not the warm kind, just the kind where you finally set down a weight you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten it wasn't part of you. I live alone on Front Street now, the house my mother saved, that I helped her save, that I'll leave to nobody in particular, and the church besides. My knee still tells me when it's going to rain. Out past the marsh, the shrimp boats go out before dawn and come back in the gold of evening. And some mornings I sit on the back porch where she held my hand, and I think about how she went to a drugstore at 83 and bought a recorder, because she knew the truth would need a witness braver than she could be in the moment, and she trusted me to be it. My father comes by on Sundays now. Not every Sunday, but enough that I keep his kind of coffee in the cupboard, the cheap percolator kind he won't admit he prefers to mine. We don't talk much. We've never talked much. But sometimes he'll sit in Tom's chair by the window and look out at the water and say something about a boat he sees on the channel, and I'll say something back, and that's the whole of it, and it's more than we had for 40 years. He brought me a photograph last month, me at 19, in front of the car the day I left, the day he wouldn't come in off the dock. He'd kept it all that time. "I used to look at this and feel like you'd left me," he said. "I look at it now and I think, there's a girl who knew exactly who she was at 19, and her father was too scared to ask." Then he put it on my mantle himself next to Tom's, and didn't say anything else about it. People are comfortable with your sacrifice as long as they never have to look at it. The moment they're made to look, really look, some of them break, and some of them double down, and you don't get to choose which. All you get to choose is whether you kept the record honest. I kept mine honest. That's the whole of what I have to offer, and it turned out to be enough. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone in your own family who quietly carried something no one ever named, or someone who's getting frightened phone calls late at night right now and doesn't know who'll believe a document over a feeling, then it was worth telling. Take care of yourself, and take care of the people who quietly take care of everyone else, because they are almost never the ones who ask. A note before you go. The financial mechanisms in this story: a recorded deed of trust, an unpaid property tax lien, a power of attorney, a shell LLC used to move funds, are real instruments, and elder financial abuse using exactly these tools happens to families across the United States every single day. Laws differ from state to state. What's true in North Carolina may be structured differently where you live. If anything here made you think about your own parents, or your own family, please don't act on what you heard in a story or a comment section. Sit down with a licensed elder law attorney in the state where your loved one lives. And if you suspect an older person is being financially exploited right now, you can call the National Council on Aging's resource line at 1-800-677-1116. They will help you find the right help near you. I'm not a lawyer, and nothing here is legal advice. I'm just someone who wanted to tell a story about a woman who learned, too late, and just in time, that being underestimated can be the quietest kind of advantage, and that the people who check the numbers are sometimes the only ones keeping a family honest.